All right. Welcome, everyone. We'll still let people filter in, but we're excited to have you all here. Wanted to first off kick off with a quick intro of myself, then hand it off to Jordan to introduce himself. I'm Reed, co-founder and CEO at Stytch. We're a modern authentication company that makes it easy for companies to build secure sign-up and login flows. And really excited to be chatting with Jordan Burris today, who has not only a wealth of knowledge when it comes to securing private companies and the identities that are engaging with them, but also has worked in the past for the White House, thinking about this from a public policy perspective. And so really excited to have him chat with us today. Jordan, I'll give you a few minutes just to introduce yourself, how you got into the identity space and securing accounts, and then we'll kick it off with the agenda.
All right, thanks, Reed, and appreciate you having me here today. My background in general, I've worked in, I would say, the digital trust arena for close to 15 years now at this point. Now, for me, digital trust is really about the confidence or promoting confidence that users have in the people, the technology, and the processes needed to secure our online world. In that time frame, held a number of roles, both in advisory capacity, working kind of behind the scenes with organizations, to what you mentioned when I served in the White House Office of the Federal CIO as Chief of Staff, working on everything IT and security related, and really sitting at the nexus of what was policy and implementation. From there, I had the ability and opportunity to work on a number of different programs, such as the expansion of the high value asset program for us, which was the catalog, if you will, of the crown jewels or the most valuable IT systems that we have across the federal landscape, and confirming that we had the most robust security controls in place for that, working on overhaul of legacy technology policies. I think in my tenure, we rescinded 40 that were outdated and basically updated them to modern standards with the eye towards continuous innovation. One of the things that I was able to work on, and part of that rescission package, was related to identity management policy, right? And so for us, there had been policies on the books that were about 15 years old. And what we wanted to do was set a strong foundation such that as technologies continue to evolve, we had the opportunity to embrace them from the federal ecosystem, but then also promote them out externally. This also gave way to the government's work with zero trust incubation, and more or less following SolarWinds, which had to help with the response on. We made the decision at that moment in time to do the mass pivot as a federal government and basically push that out broader across the ecosystem. And so for me, leaving government and working at a company now called Secure, where we perform. We provide a platform out for our customers across a number of industry verticals, both commercial and public sector in particular, where we're specializing in identity verification and fraud risk management, right? The idea that we should be able to confirm who someone is online without introducing additional friction and really easing that user experience. So from my perspective, it continues, if you will, a nice little career arc and journey where, starting off understanding kind of how the policies were put together, how we're architecting these solutions, and more importantly, and now taking the opportunity to bring products into this space that really help solve and improve the lives of everyone who engages with digital technologies.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jordan. Again, very excited to have you. And we're going to dive into a lot of the details behind that experience, both at the White House and Secure, in a few minutes. To start, though, we're going to set the table for everyone so that everyone's on the same page around MFA and the growing cyber attacks that are developing, and why new forms of MFA are coming to fold. And also, just as a quick aside, if people hear my dog barking in the background, I apologize. He's very frustrated that I'm not taking him for a walk right now. But yeah, excited to dive in. And so to kick it off on agenda, there's a few different things that we're going to cover here today. We're not going to bore you with slides, just maybe the first 10 minutes. We want everyone aligned on what are the growing cyber attack threats. There's some really interesting new ones coming to fold in 2023, particularly with the advent of more advanced AI and accessibility of that. And what is the role of MFA in curbing those? And then we'll get into really a direct conversation with Jordan around his experience when it comes to identity verification, how to match this with the MFA initiatives and growing cyber attacks that we're seeing. And then finally, please do submit questions from the audience. Any questions that you have, we'll save time to answer at the end. So we'll add them to the queue if you want to put them in at any moment, and we're excited to dive in. So first, a little bit of context on setting the table of the current MFA and cyber attack landscape. I think it's probably no surprise to anyone that's joining this webinar that cyber attacks are a growing threat. Now, 80% of cybersecurity breaches are due to compromised credentials. So that's a user reuses a password somewhere. Maybe they use it with Target. Target gets breached, but they're using that same password with a bank account or something more sensitive. About 45% of US companies suffered such a data breach in 2021, which is why it's so prolific. And then there's been 42 million individuals that have suffered losses greater than 50 billion in aggregate value due to identity theft and associated fraud in 2021. And the last stat that's just a major one from the last 5 years is that over the last 5 years, over 500 million credentials and passwords have been hacked and stolen. So one of the things that we found, and obviously a reason that MFA has gained a lot of traction in the security community, is that given the prevalence of breaches that steal passwords, password reuse, you really have to treat passwords often from an application security perspective as pre-breached in this current environment. And so cyber attacks are growing, but username password is just not enough when it comes to securing applications and the users that leverage those applications. And authentication strength does matter. 99.9% of attacks can be blocked by MFA. The cheapest way for an attacker to try to steal someone's account is to run bots with stolen passwords against a login field and do this en masse with very little cost to that attacker. And so MFA is a huge hurdle or blocker in many of these cases where you raise the cost of the attack. And I think likely everyone knows what MFA is, but when we're talking about MFA, we're talking about 2 or more verification steps. So the primary authentication factor might be something like a password, but it also might be email verification or phone verification. 2FA is the second factor that we're adding on to this chain of events in order to increase security. And when it comes to MFA in 2023, not all MFA methods are created equal. There's an interesting dilemma that we have in terms of the highest security MFA options also being the lowest adopted, and in many cases, not as usable as the more prevalent but lower security ones. So if you take an example of some of the most popular MFA methods that applications will consider when they're building, it's things like SMS passcodes, TOTP apps, so like Google Authenticator and Duo Authenticator, and then things like hardware keys, e.g. YubiKeys, or leveraging device biometrics like Touch ID and Face ID. And across the spectrum, you can find that the highest security ones, so YubiKey, biometrics, authenticator apps, those end up actually seeing the lowest adoption if you look at most companies. And we'll get into why that is in a minute, but it typically has to do with familiarity, cost or friction of setting up an MFA method, and accessibility. And the ones that are highest adoption, things like SMS 2FA, do tend to hold many of the greatest risks that we have in terms of actually installing a secure MFA method. And the pros and cons, because there is really no one size fits all for companies. It will depend on your demographic, user base, how much value behind your account or your users' accounts you're protecting. But the different pros and cons are that for SMS one-time passcodes, the big pro is that it's very familiar and easy to use. There's a reason that 95% of the time that you see MFA, it's likely SMS 2FA. It's very easy. Users have become used to it, and so they've adopted it at a higher clip. But it is vulnerable to a number of attack vectors, such as phishing or SIM swap attacks, where individuals can actually steal your phone number and receive those passcodes themselves. Authenticator apps are more secure, but for anyone that's gone through the process of setting up TOTP, you have to download an external app, which a lot of applications don't want to put their users through, and a lot of users won't endure that friction. It does solve for deliverability or SIM swap issues, but it is a higher user adoption hurdle, and phishing risk still exists. And then the last 2 factors that we'll talk about today are both in the phishing resistant camp, where they make a huge step forwards in terms of account security, but there are some real adoption issues today. So for YubiKey is one of the biggest reasons that this has been adopted mostly in a professional setting. So whether you're logging into your company's GitHub or Gusto or something like that, is that in the consumer setting, it's just not very plausible that users are going to be willing to spend $50 on this hardware security device that also isn't super simple to set up. Biometrics are definitely more promising in this regard because they're built into the devices that we've already paid for and set up, like our iPhone or our Mac or Windows. And they're phishing resistant and fairly familiar. One of the things we'll talk about a little bit later, though, is that there are different responses and skepticism to biometrics, where some individuals fear how much data they might be giving up. There are some common myths that we'll talk about. And all of these lead to one thing that, I think is ever present when it comes to authentication, which is meeting your users where they are. Typically, you want to layer in an approach where you give optionality in MFA, understanding that you won't always get everyone to the most secure option, but the theoretical security model of an MFA method is only worthwhile if you actually encourage adoption of that MFA method. And so if you only require YubiKey, but no users enroll, obviously there's not much of a security advantage there. One case study that we wanted to use to kind of center this discussion around MFA, different methods, and their success rate at stopping account takeovers is really interesting data that Coinbase, the cryptocurrency exchange, put out a couple weeks ago, where they both revealed the popularity of different MFA methods on the platform and the correlation of those MFA methods with successful account takeovers. And it's no surprise that the most popular MFA method is SMS. 95% of users choose that, even though they can choose between push notifications, security key, and TOTP. But it's also no surprise that 95% of successful account takeover attacks occur with this MFA method. And what's actually the most interesting piece here is that even though the most secure MFA methods only make up 5% of overall users, they comprise, and of account takeovers, they comprise 57% of customer funds protected by Coinbase. And one of the things to think about here is just the incentive behind attackers when they attack a Coinbase account. Most of them are targeting these higher value accounts where it may have hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in them, but the cost of attacking something that's protected by security key versus SMS 2FA is dramatically different because you need an actual physical attack vector versus something like a phishing attack or convincing a T-Mobile support rep to transfer someone's phone number. The last piece that we'll talk about is how attacks are changing in 2023. And one of the things that we've seen just in the first couple months or the first 6 weeks of 2023 is the impact that all these new AI tools and the common awareness of AI's capabilities could have on account takeover. So there's a great analysis by Darktrace, a cybersecurity company, that found since ChatGPT has launched, the average linguistic complexity of phishing emails has jumped 17%. And they are attributing that likely due to AI advancements that many of these attackers are now using. And when we think about this, we think about how the game theory behind phishing is changing, where historically attackers have used obvious typos in phishing attempts because it allows them to infer that the respondents that still engage with them are likely to be more gullible, and there's a higher propensity for them to be able to actually successfully phish them. But what's changing, or the reason behind that, is that phishing is predominantly a manual attack vector. So there's a live conversation that has to occur after somebody hooks you with a phishing email or text. And so attackers know there's a real labor cost behind serving these phishing attacks. And what's changing with AI tools is that you could effectively reduce this human cost in the loop for attackers to zero. And at that point, it makes sense for them to engage in much more complex conversations where they're not just trying to weed out who are they going to have the highest likelihood attacking, but they should theoretically widen their net and increase the volume of attacks that they're perpetrating. So that was mostly what we wanted to cover in terms of just setting the table. Really what we'd like to spend a lot of the time hereafter talking about is just chatting with Jordan from his experience, both in the public and private sector, on what he's seen over the last few years in terms of this evolution of zero trust, MFA, identity fraud, et cetera, but also where he thinks we're going in 2023, 2024. And so to tee this up, Jordan, the first question I actually wanted to ask about was, as we've been talking about this webinar, one of the things that we've been chatting about are some of your beliefs on where MFA needs to go in the future. And I think you have a really interesting perspective on identity verification and how that loops into the authentication equation. And so thinking about Stytch as an authentication company, Secure as an identity verification company, I'd love for you to share a little bit more with the audience about how you see these combining and what are the pieces that we need to be aware of as we're truly hardening application security.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, there's been many pushes both from the government and industry. I mean, even campaigns and folks that have been talking about the importance of getting MFA right. There's been a constant beating of the drum, and to your point, highlighted earlier, there's been low user adoption, right? Because the reality is that when you've created too much friction for folks, especially when it comes to the authentication process, they want to go towards something more simplistic. I think that with the advent of things like passkeys, hopefully we're going to get to a point where the user experience will be simplified in a manner that folks are more interested in adopting them. But it comes with its own challenges, right, in a number of different areas. So where we specialize is identity verification, right? We're Secure is focused day in and day out is just confirming that the person on the other end of the screen is the actual individual that is presenting the identity. Far too often, unfortunately, when accounts are being created, there isn't actually a robust process in place to confirm that that is actually linked to them. Often when, and think about it, anyone today can register for a Facebook account or register for a Twitter profile or something to that effect. I know I've picked social media platforms, but that extends to a number of other use cases, in particular, both in education and others. And so unfortunately, you have the potential that they could fraudulently, paint an identity that may be not theirs, right? I could be pretending to be you at the end of the day, or I could make up a completely fictitious identity. Ultimately, when we start to couple that with things like the usage of FIDO and stronger MFA, all we're really doing is taking a fake identity and giving someone a strong credential behind it. Now, what if, for an example, we had a weak process up front when that identity was initially being created, right? Let's say that I'm slow to the game and I decided that I wanted to take my time in actually adopting one of these more phishing resistant authenticators, and there was a weak verification process up front. I run the risk that by the time I go to create the account or establish an authenticator in my name that allows me to assert my identity, someone could have already taken it. Now I'm going through an entire process of having to claw back and claim what my identity is and prove myself effectively, right? And so that kind of creates this interesting inflection point in how we're evaluating the subject. I think that as the focus and the push continues to be around adopting stronger MFA, equally we need to be looking at what we are doing from an identity verification and fraud risk management standpoint, because whenever we're running into these instances where you have newer individuals, think of the younger population as they're starting to establish their accounts or start to engage in the online ecosystem, or you have the case of, I've lost my devices, or maybe I only had one in particular, and I'm having to deal with account lockout or, reproofing in particular. A weak process is basically a weak link in the chain. And that's not something that we should be working towards getting ahead of that as an industry. And I think that generally what we're going to see over the next couple of years is really just a continued push in both angles with an increased focus. And you can even see that today with some of the work from the FIDO Alliance, increased focus on what are we doing from the identity verification and binding standpoint. So binding being the linkage between that strong identity and the authenticator. And so I think, as these things continue to evolve, we're going to see basically a need for both disciplines to come together to make sure that we're really getting an identity that truly is bounded to a real individual. And that way they can use it in what is a seamless seamless customer experience manner.
Yeah, I think that's right on the nose with how we think about the account recovery process in particular, where authentication can only take you so far. As you're obviously going to design your sign up and login flows to be as secure and tight from an authentication perspective as possible. Account recovery, authentication can give you some answers where if you decide, if they have a backup email or phone or some type of posture where you're comfortable with them saying, I've lost this, but I'm willing to recover either my password or some other part of the account with another authentication. But you're right that there's a lot of times where the answer is I've lost most or maybe all of those identifiers. So whether it's they've lost access to the email account or they've lost the device that was doing the device verification. And what we typically see is there's two different pieces for companies that they have to think through. One is like the programmatic way that they determine account recovery is sufficient for somebody to reclaim that account. So what are the ways they build into the app itself? But the second, that's sometimes given less thought we see, is the actual human in the loop in their support system of somebody is going to be calling up support probably, and often this is attackers, very frustrated and angry, yelling about why can't they get into their account. And there has to be a really strong process and posture internally of how you decide what is verifiable and what's not. And I think your point about binding identity, being able to do things like identity checks in those scenarios is really critical.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, I'll tell you a story from my former life, right? So the federal government actually adopted what they call personal identity verification cards, or PIV cards. These are actually one of the first forms of phishing-resistant authenticators that exist. In order to get these types of cards, you actually had to show up in person, present your fingerprints, do a number of things. And these things were launched around 2003. The number one thing that would occur when someone lost their PIV card is that they would actually roll back to password, because the process, depending on where they were in the ecosystem. So let's say that my enrollment station was somewhere in the DC area, and however, I was on travel in California and I needed to access something, and it was impossible for me to get back to DC at the time. The only way that I could get access was to do a rollback, right? And so in these types of instances, I see similar themes playing out as we make this push to MFA, is that we need to be able to solve, to your point, the part of the equation of how we are actually going to manage these things at scale and for all the different use cases, because more often than not, we as humans, things happen, and as a result, we need to make sure that the experience is seamless at the end of the day.
Definitely. And that's a great example where even for something as secure as a government issued identifier, they were struggling with the rollback when somebody did lose that main card. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, Jordan, was I'm curious from your perspective, what are some, and we talked a little bit about this in the slides, but I'm curious, what have you most noticed over the last 1 to 2 years in terms of the evolving threat landscape? What concerns you? And then I'm curious, as you look into 2023, what are the things that are, salient for you? Is it the rise of AI? Is it the rise of synthetic fraud? Are there other pieces that are coming to mind where you either think it's properly resourced by companies, or maybe there are some blind spots that we have collectively?
Yeah, the number one thing I'm seeing today is that there's actually a lack of parity in the way in which we're leveraging technologies and tools today to safeguard ourselves, as compared to those, I would say, adversaries or malicious users in particular, right? To your point with usage of Chat GPT, or even those who choose to use biometrics in particular, that malicious users, fraudsters, they're not beholden to some type of rule that prevents them from touching these technologies. However, what I've seen over the last couple of years, unfortunately, is that as these technologies have gained and hit the public forum, there's been kind of this negative connotation backlash towards using some of them with requiring really what is broad sets of education, to the point of, when we think about biometrics for the purpose of using Face ID or Touch ID, there's a whole educational element that goes along to what actually is happening with those biometrics, where is it being stored. And unfortunately, we've seen even in some states that there's been laws passed like that. In Illinois, with Biometric Information Privacy Act, for an example, basically was designed in order to limit the collection and use of biometrics, in particular for those within the state of Illinois. So we have kind of this interesting tug of war, if you will, between the usages of these technologies and then kind of the rejection of them overall. And I see that's creating an environment where effectively those who would do harm are going to get the upper hand the longer that we operate in this space. Now, it's not to say that we should just throw all caution to the wind and that we shouldn't be evaluating and vetting any tools that are being used. But I think that what it means is that A, education needs to become more important, and B, we need to be operating in a perspective where we're helping to increase transparency about why these tools are being selected, what we are hoping to combat or mitigate, such that there is just general broader comfort related to leveraging them day in and day out in order to secure our systems and our applications.
Certainly. And I think something that comes to mind there is when we talk about the trade-off between adoption and security, obviously a lot of the authentication and identity community has been working for decades to figure out, is there something that we can find is very familiar and easy to use, highly convenient, but has some of those phishing resistant capabilities that we were talking about earlier, and makes it the cost to attack it significantly higher. And I think you'd mentioned this earlier, but we didn't talk about it directly. Passkeys is one of those things that is getting a lot of hype, where it's saying, okay, if SMS 2FA is something that we found vast majority of users are willing to use, they're familiar with it, has a lot of drawbacks, right, in terms of deliverability. If you're flying, you can't 2FA, phishing, SIM swap, et cetera. Is there something, though, that's as familiar and easy to use, but on the higher part of the security spectrum? And I think passkeys, that's at least the narrative behind them. And I think there's a lot of promise behind that, because one of the biggest issues that we found with biometric adoption in the past is that it's device tied. I'm not able to sync it across my iCloud or my Google account across my phone and my laptop. And that's what's really exciting to us about passkeys, at least the potential, is that there's still a lot of updates happening to OS systems, et cetera, but you are going to get cross-device biometrics the first time at scale built in. So you might get something as simple as SMS, but much further up the security curve. And I'm curious, because while it's super promising, we also need to think about the human behind that, like behind the MFA choice, and whether somebody will be comfortable enrolling in that. And we do find, I think the last study I saw was that, something like 58% of consumers prefer biometrics over other authentication methods, but that's still a large gap, the 42%, to get us to full penetration. And you had started to talk a little bit about sometimes the hesitance that people might have around biometrics. I know something else that we've talked about that is just like a edge case that we need to consider, but not a very small edge case. It's actually a material one, of people in the same household that use the same device. And how do we, cordon off access? And so that's something that I'd be really curious to hear your perspective on, is as we think about the human behind these MFA decisions, of both the education piece, but also some of the other maybe hiccups that we'll encounter as we try to get to this future of, whether it's biometrics or something else. I'd be curious if you could share a little bit more on what some of those more intricate difficulties are that we have to design around.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, starting with the first part related to kind of the biometric adoption, and more importantly, how the public perceives it, right? Even within the public sector or government in particular, right? There's been a forever debate about, how far is too far. For an example, I know folks like the TSA are working, and they have been working for some time, even during my time in government, to create an ID-less experience when leaving your car and walking to an airplane terminal, or the gate in particular, such that you didn't have to pull out your ID anymore, or even your plane ticket in particular, right? Because of the way cameras work and the ability to link to things like authoritative databases such as the DMV databases or others that are managed by the government. That scares a lot of people, because you start to get into the perspective of big brother government. And so while there is a potential for easier user experience coming on the outside of it, right, there's importance for folks to understand kind of why that's being done and how that's being adopted. I have members of my own family who refuse to use biometrics, will run from all types of Face ID, turn everything off on their camera, stick with passcode and PIN. And so ultimately what that comes down into is that there just needs to be the options for choice, right? There has to be options for choice for individuals, recognizing that we can't necessarily force folks towards leveraging these devices in particular. There's also the premise, to dovetail to the second part of, when you're thinking about family households and things along those lines, I think there's a few studies out there that highlighted that within, multifamily households, there's roughly about a 10% reuse rate for a single device being used across multiple family members in particular, right? So that becomes effectively what is their lifeblood. I know for me personally, outside of my work computer, which I'm using currently for it, I don't have a working personal PC. I use my mobile phone for just about everything these days. And it's my personal choice as a result. So if I lost that from a personal standpoint, that becomes a whole mess in particular. Now you take that and you multiply it by the fact that if I had multiple members of my family also leveraging that device, that also becomes a problem in particular, right? And so we have to always be thinking about ways in which we're really better leveraging what's out there today, making it easier for people, or for those who don't have access to these resources, such as someone who may have to show up at a library in order to perform a transaction or engage online in particular. That's actually where I end up going half the time when I need to do something online. I'll actually go to my local library in order to do it. And so I would say that we just always have to be constantly thinking about what the impact is to folks and designing so that there is that optionality, there's off ramps, there's on ramps, and that we're really able to create what is effectively an omni-channel experience for folks, recognizing that the predominant way is going to be online.
Definitely. And I think one other thing that you touched on a little bit earlier that I would just echo for the audience is the education piece. You'd mentioned some family members and some people that don't trust biometrics as an authentication factor. And we find in user testing that's fairly common. That's probably a large chunk of the 42% that don't say biometrics are their preferred method. And what's interesting, what we find is that people have a different perception of biometrics when it is built into the device, like when I log into my Apple iPhone, versus when I go to a site that's now asking me for my biometrics. Like a great example, I think, is Best Buy, who Best Buy was one of the earlier adopters of WebAuthn in the consumer side, which is great. But you'll see if you go to their site, they have to do a lot of education around we don't actually get your biometric data. We're just doing a check with the device. And I think there's two pieces there. One is that you can solve a lot of the concern that an application level will be able to access things like your fingerprint or your Face ID, but there is some percentage that I have never seen the stats on this that likely won't even give their biometric to the Apple or Google originating device. So to your point, I think it goes back to choice. Education can get us some of the way there, but it's likely not going to get us to 100% biometric adoption in the next few years.
Yeah. And I mean, look, and also it's important to put things in plain language for people, right? We in the tech community, especially in the identity community, sometimes have the perspective that we use too many buzzwords, unfortunately. So it's harder to understand about what is actually happening. And so the more that we leverage also plain language, it gives us the ability to at least help with some of that education.
Definitely. And one thing I was curious about is, do you have any viewpoint on the relative complexity of 2FA options for applications and companies considering adopting 2FA? They're obviously in an interesting position where, as we talk about it, in order to increase both enrollment and security, you need to have multiple options, but that does increase the complexity for them. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about that, where they both have to think about these pieces of multiple MFA, but also identity verification, et cetera? Is there any guidance that you'd have for those companies?
Yeah, I mean, just generally, it's really about understanding kind of the overall workflow for the life cycle of that identity and how it is being managed in particular. And the reality is that it's about creating the prioritization around that particular pillar or element within the stack. Today, I would say that's not necessarily the case, right? That there hasn't been an increased focus on the identity stack in particular. It's kind of been in some cases, an afterthought or something that's just there. In particular, because of the added complexity, we need to be constantly seeking tools that help us with orchestration related to this. And then just, again, doing what we can to make that part of our ecosystem the most robust, because even beyond what we see today as it relates to humans that are engaging, we also have the reality that the more that we're using things like robotic process automation and other AI-based technologies, or AI similar like technologies, rather, should I say, that they also have their own identities, their own footprints that they have online, and their need to use what would be stronger credentials as well. And so you think about giving MFA to a bot and how you manage that in particular, that creates its own level of complexity. And so, just generally, it's about, kind of pushing the boundary on where we've seen investment today, and then recognizing that, as part of the journey that every organization has to take, a broader investment is largely going to be needed for this space.
And I've been watching some of the Q&A come in, and before we get too far off the biometrics discussion, I thought there's a couple good questions there that we could tactically answer. So the first question is, how much have biometrics, particularly fingerprint, improved over the years in terms of hack resistance? And the person is saying that they assume hardware security keys are still superior to fingerprints today, but is that accurate? I think one of the things that's similar to the common misconception that some end users have, where it's I'm giving my actual biometric data to this application. There's also this misunderstanding sometimes about how biometrics work when I use a Face ID or Touch ID on Apple or Google. And so one thing that I'll mention here that, one of the big reasons from a security perspective I love biometrics is that historically they're actually two factors in one. It's both, do you have this device because it's tied to the secure enclave of your mobile or your laptop device? And then it's also, do you have this biometric inherent factor that is that one's more probabilistic, right? Like my brother might be able to pass my Face ID on my iPhone, but he wouldn't be able to do it on his own iPhone or elsewhere. And so you both get the like something you have authentication factor, but also the something you are. And when it comes to fingerprint, at least when you're talking about the installed biometrics in like Apple, Google, Microsoft, that security has remained fairly similar with fingerprint over time where it's tied to the device. And so I would actually say I'm a bigger fan when I can protect with 2FA a highly secure account to do WebAuthn with biometrics than I am to use my YubiKey. I do use my YubiKey when it's not offered sometimes. But the one thing I think about with my YubiKey is that my YubiKey, the one that I use, does not have the fingerprint reader on it. So if you somehow got into my laptop, there's not really a check on the biometric inherence factor. It doesn't mean that the fingerprint is foolproof, but I do appreciate that there's that extra level of, do you actually have a copy of my fingerprint in order to get past that? So I would say I think fingerprint personally is more secure than hardware security keys on average. But the one big asterisk I want to put on this is that it depends on the implementation of biometrics. There are a lot of companies that have come out with cross-device biometrics where it's effectively just probabilistic. Does this look like the Face ID image that they hashed and you enrolled in on a different device months ago, or does this look like the fingerprint? And I would put that in a very different security posture than the device-bound biometrics that we're living with Apple, Google, Microsoft. And I'm curious, Jordan, would you add any difference of opinion or anything there on that question?
No, I mean, look, I think you covered it well in the perspective there. And I think just the highlight on like the efficacy of what we're seeing related to the various forms of biometrics. I mean, ultimately, the algorithms that are underlying it are getting better over time, right? Folks are continuously innovating, but I love the point that you highlighted, Reed, on, it's about the implementation, because if you have a poor implementation or poor set of algorithms that are being used, it's not inherently going to be more secure, and it's definitely going to be, something that's subject to hacking or cracking, depending on how you want to frame it. And so it really is about making sure that you're understanding what you're putting into the ecosystem, that you've tested and validated that is the thing that works for you, algorithms in particular in this instance when you're talking about biometrics, such that you are getting kind of what you anticipate or expect ultimately from that form factor. Definitely.
And then the other question on biometrics that I figured we'd cover now while it's top of mind is somebody asked, as both a user and industry professional, I see much more adoption of mobile device biometrics over desktop WebAuthn, YubiKey biometrics for brands of all sizes. How do you both view the progression and importance of such authentication across all types of devices? And is biometrics with MFA the future of secure authentication? Or what alternatives do you recommend for users who do not own devices with biometric capabilities? And so I think we probably both have a viewpoint here. Jordan, I don't know if you want to provide a little context, but I'm happy to take a stab as well.
Yeah, I think that I view this ecosystem as something where optionality must be king, right? It must be paramount for it. And so, yes, biometrics are getting broader adoption, and I would agree on the mobile device aspect as well. But at the end of the day, not everyone is going to have the technology or components in order to facilitate it. So we have to continuously be looking for other methods in order to give them that strong phishing resistance in particular, right? I know there continues in some cases to be this debate about, well, I guess kind of through the perspective of attrition over time, folks will get more and more secure, but in reality, that's not going to be the case, right? There's always going to be those who just don't operate within those parameters. And so I operate from the perspective that we should try to be the most inclusive when it comes to our tech. And as such, we just need to find ways to maximize the ability for folks to get through. And then if there is a gap, continue to invest in building out the technologies needed in order to bring those people into the ecosystem.
Definitely. And the only thing I would add to that is to this person, and thank you, Sarah, for the question, to this person's question about, or the point about why they see so much more mobile device biometrics than desktop. It's mostly comes down to a pragmatic UX approach from companies where one of the biggest historical problems with biometrics has also been the reason it's very secure, which is that it's device bound. So for example, when I enroll in 2FA with like Chase app and I do my mobile biometric, there's no way for Chase, the desktop experience, to know what my biometric is. So unless they do like a push notification or QR code that takes me back to my phone, there's no way for them to do biometrics there unless they enroll me separately. And what a lot of companies have found is that that becomes quite confusing to consumers to have to enroll in multiple different biometric experiences, especially when you also think about like account recovery when they lose that device, et cetera. So a lot of companies have thought about what is a cross-device 2FA that is just simpler for users to understand, where they can use that 2FA method both on mobile and on desktop. And that's why you get like SMS as a common denominator, is that while it's being delivered over mobile, it's the same route with which you'd authenticate if you went to the web experience or the desktop experience. One reason though, in addition to that I think we see a lot more mobile adoption is just because everyone has historically been much more used to logging into their mobile phone with Face ID than we have logging into our laptops with Touch ID, because Touch ID has been a more recent development from the manufacturers to add that in. The last thing I'll mention here, though, you've probably heard passkeys, both discussed here, but outside of here, as something that a lot of security specialists are excited about. The big thing that passkeys solve for is biometrics go from being device tied. So like one device has a different biometric marker than another. So you're enrolling in multiple, managing multiple as a user, and the confusion that comes with that. To passkeys are synced to your common cloud account. So that's iCloud on iOS, that's the G Drive on Google, and it effectively gives us cross-device biometrics. So the future with passkeys is not just MFA, it's also primary authentication, where I could theoretically, as the more devices and browsers update in the coming months and quarters, I could sign up for Home Depot on the mobile app. I could then go to mobile web and sign in with the same Face ID. And then I could go to desktop and I could sign in with my Touch ID, even though I've never enrolled in it. And that should theoretically be a smooth experience. I think where you still see a lot of friction today is the browser's UI of telling the user, like, do they recognize which one they're using? How does that flow go? But there's a lot of potential there. So I think to your question about, is biometrics the future secure authentication? I do generally believe that biometrics will be the vast majority of secure authentication, but you're still going to have a large double-digit percentage that it doesn't cater to, both from their like comfort level with it, but also, as you mentioned, not having devices that have biometric capabilities. So I think for that, we're going to still have legacy methods for a while, probably another 5, maybe even 10 years, dealing with things like SMS, 2FA, et cetera. And so it will come down to trying to move as many users to the easiest, most secure option, but still making sure, as Jordan has mentioned a couple of times, that you have that option set so that every user can be served in at least as secure of a way as their individual device and comfort level allows them to be. Great. A couple last questions, Jordan, some other audience questions that have come in, and people feel free to throw other audience questions in. We have a few here, but it looks like we'll have 13 minutes, so we might be able to get to 1 or 2 more. I'm curious if you have a perspective, and I'm happy to start on this question, but the question is, who is doing best-in-class MFA right now? We look at a lot of authentication flows, and so we're pretty familiar with this. One I'll just add off the top is I think Coinbase does a really good job of offering different optionality to users and understanding they're not going to force everyone to get to the most secure option, but at least giving different methods so that the very tech savvy can choose the most secure one, but the ones that maybe wouldn't choose that are still enrolled in some option, so they get 100% of their users enrolled. I think they're a good example, but I'm curious, Jordan, if there are any other apps or companies that come to mind as best in class today.
We won't talk necessarily about companies or apps. I'll talk about sectors, right? I've seen that basically the two strongest sectors being government and financial services. So I would agree with your assessment on where you would see Coinbase in particular. But I would say that those are two sectors that I would say have the strongest adoption as it relates to MFA broadly, and that are typically doing the best. And there's a question about what parts of it, what use cases in particular are doing better than others. And I would see that as we at least progress over the next year, we're probably going to see more for a push across both sectors for stronger adoption, and various mandates to just make sure that that is the case, especially when we're talking about consumer-based workflows.
Definitely. Yeah, I would big plus one on that, on the industries that you're talking about. What's interesting to me with financial services is I've noticed that younger fintechs, so like the Robinhoods of the world, the Coinbases, tend to be a little bit more advanced than even my like legacy bank that I use. My legacy bank right now only lets me do SMS 2FA, which has been a point of frustration. I've submitted a few support tickets in the past on that, but to no avail. And so it's interesting. I don't have a great explanation for why that is. It might be one theory on the crypto side is that the transactions are irreversible. So there's a lot more emphasis on the companies not wanting to cover that fraud. So maybe that's why Coinbase and Robinhood, which has a crypto component, invest so much. But yeah, that's just an interesting aside. The last one that I'll mention is on the SaaS side, some B2B apps like Stripe do a really good job understanding that that is a very valuable account that a company holds. Gusto is another example where you get these companies that are dealing with payroll, payments, invoicing, et cetera, where there are bank accounts attached to them. That will give you a good idea of apps that have a lot to lose, and so therefore have thought a lot about the MFA enrollment maximization options that are provided, sometimes mandating certain options to make sure that they're not at risk of fraud on the hundreds of thousands of dollars level if you're talking about payroll or something like that. And so those are a few of the examples that I would also highlight.
Yeah, and I think just to quickly chime in on that, what I've found is that typically when you have those longer standing, I'm going to say monoliths that are out there, it's harder to basically change course and adopt something new because there's so much interconnected risk associated with every single change. When you have some of the newer companies that are just getting started, it's easy to start from the beginning. It actually goes into the premise of security by design. It's better to do it from the beginning than try to bolt it on later. And I think that also plays a lot into what we see in terms of adoption of different types of security patterns or protocols across companies of different ages and focuses.
Yeah, and that actually leads to one of the questions I did want to ask you about, Jordan, because I think you have a very interesting perspective from both government and secure here of the start problem. Like there's a lot of inertia that people have in their current flows, say they have no MFA or maybe they just have SMS. Do you have any guidance from like when the White House was trying to get to zero trust, trying to figure out how to avoid phishing, of like where you can start so that you're not at analysis paralysis of all the different things you should be doing, but realizing what's pragmatic to get done now?
Yeah, it was actually a conversation we used to have quite a bit. And some of my former colleagues I know are still carrying that forward. The reality is you just have to start. And I know that sounds really, really simple, but it's pick an application, pick a segment, pick part of the infrastructure and just get started. It's recognizing that it's not zero trust is not a destination. It's a journey. It's a continuous journey in particular. And so it is important to get started, right? And focusing on the things that you control. So, for any organization, I would say, whether it's protecting your most valuable asset first, or starting off with what would be something that is newer, coming into the ecosystem, basically going through the muscle memory of understanding what it is to deploy and integrate and incorporate, better IAM security practices or others into that is really the best way to go about it, because then you get the learnings, which you can then use to drive efforts at scale. In particular, right? If you spend too much time in analysis, you basically get 2-3 years down the road and realize you've done nothing. And then there's some type of galvanizing event, which drives everyone to do things really quickly, which in some courses or some cases leads stuff to things to break ultimately. So, one of the things I saw very quickly is that, especially in the rush to do stuff, I'll look at, the pandemic in particular, a lot of work went into preparing, public sector, preparing many organizations for a digital shift. When the pandemic occurred, we didn't get everything right, and unfortunately, we saw that play out with what happened with identity fraud at rampant scales across the country, and it's because we didn't necessarily start in those areas, and we kind of saved them towards the last part. And so, I think it's just important to really start make progress and be incremental in the way that you're thinking about rolling out these types of technologies, and especially if you identify gaps, so that way you can later on down the road get to the place you want to be or the maturation you want to be much earlier.
Yeah, certainly. And this may be the ex-consultant in me, but something that we think a lot about is there's a 2x2 matrix that we use internally for prioritization, which has on the y-axis impact, so high impact at the top,
Yep.
low impact at the bottom, effort on the x-axis, low effort on the left, high effort on the right. And trying to figure out what is in that quadrant of low effort, high impact. Are there certain routes in your application that keep you up at night? Like if you're a payroll company, are you really worried about someone adding another admin? And is that the area where you start just requiring those admins that have the capabilities to do that are enrolling something more secure? So I think to your point, it's just start, but then as you're starting, think about like, what is the one area that it's probably a smaller problem. It may be smaller on user base, so it gives you a nice testing landing spot, but creates likely the ROI that you're looking for in terms of mitigating risk.
Oh, great point.
The final thing I wanted to echo on your answer is there's usually inevitably at some point, some moment that gets people to like, oh crap, I should really worry about this and I should worry about it right now. And one that I think you don't usually know when this is happening, but I think an interesting example that I wouldn't have even expected is thinking about like Facebook's account system. They got a lot of pressure for increasing security after Russia invaded Ukraine, because one of the problems they found was that Russian information security operatives were figuring out how to take over Ukrainian generals' accounts in order to post propaganda from them. And it's one of those things where like, there's probably lots of these apps on the consumer side where you don't think about the level of security that you should be paying attention to on an account perspective until there's some moment that becomes really emblematic. For Twitter, that might have been Jack Dorsey's account being SIM swapped a couple of years ago. And so when you think about kind of that matrix of how you prioritize things, like how do you stop those kind of like high level risks if you're in that space is definitely one of the things that I would advise. And how do you start there? So I think we're about at time, and we've answered as many of the questions as we could get to. I want to say, first off, just thank you to Jordan for sharing your knowledge and experience from both the White House and Secure. Really great to get the perspective on not just authentication when it comes to MFA, but also identity binding, identity verification, and the different ways that you need to approach MFA adoption and just getting started. So I wanted to say thank you to Jordan. Thank you to the audience. What we'll do after this presentation is we've recorded it. And so we'll actually publish this on the Stytch YouTube channel. If you want to take a look at it later, we'll likely send a note just to let attendees know. But again, thanks for joining us. If you have questions for either of us, feel free to reach out. I'm Reed at Stytch.com. Jordan, feel free, whether you want to share your email or not, with any questions that come your way.
Yeah, absolutely. So folks can feel free to reach me at jordan.burris@socure.com. And so happy to talk more about identity and fraud in particular. But Reed, definitely want to thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. And I'm excited to see what you're all doing in this space.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jordan. Have a great weekend, both Jordan and everyone else. Really appreciate you tuning in.
All right. Take care.